you're right. I mean, I prosecuted the Rochdale case in 2011, so it's 13 years plus since the convictions. I then led nationally on this issue. We got to a stage within 2 or 3 years, Adrian, where we had made a massive improvement in the way we were tackling so-called grooming, but also child sexual abuse more generally. By 2015, we had the highest conviction rate for child sexual abuse. That was the work we did together to bring that about. But you wouldn't have believed that from what Musk and his people were saying. I think the issue of class hasn't been given the attention it deserves. The vast majority of the victims in this case were working class, whether they were from South Asian backgrounds or from white backgrounds, but they were working class.
Hi there, my name's Adrian Goldberg. Welcome to the Byline podcast, recorded live for the Byline Times at the Byline Festival at Keele University. As I'm recording this, we're just a few minutes away from a big event at the festival. The author James Bloodworth and the former Chief Crown Prosecutor for Northern England, Nazir Afzal, are going to be talking about men and the manosphere. But I particularly wanted to speak to Nazir because I've known him for many years, spoken to him on various podcasts, including this one. He is the prosecutor who was responsible for bringing the Rochdale grooming gang to justice. That was many, many years ago. Now, the Labour government has announced an investigation, a full national inquiry into the grooming gangs scandal. And I want to ask you, Nazir, do you feel pride in that moment, or do you feel that in some way, because of the whole furor around grooming gangs, that the good work that you have done has been somehow cheapened and weaponized?
All of those things, Adrian. When the owner of the X platform decided to attack what this government, the state, the United Kingdom, has done around so-called grooming at the end of January, there was only one agenda, which was to create hostility and tension towards... Clearly it was aimed at the current Prime Minister, but of course I was the man who worked for the current Prime Minister at the time, so by default I was the one that was getting it in the neck. And there was more than just... Never mind me, the victims and survivors who I spoke to during that time were horrified by what was happening, because if you think about it, Adrian, when the trials happened, and there were several trials, it wasn't just that one, we provided them with all sorts of wraparound support to help them cope with not just the trial, but the immediate aftermath. And then out of the blue, at the beginning of 2025, they are now reliving what happened to them 10, 15, 20 years ago, without the support that existed then. There was I know one or two that was suicidal, because of what was being said. All of them were being exploited and re-exploited by Musk and his followers. And it's a tragedy, really, because at the end of the day, it doesn't fix the problem. It just creates the kind of tension that at the end of the day means we won't fix the problem.
Yeah, one of the saddest things about this, as you say, is that victims of a most horrendous crime are often forgiven in the finger pointing towards who is responsible for that horrendous crime.
Absolutely. They were not on Musk's radar. They were not on the radar of those within this country who were joining in on that amplified voice that he was giving to this issue. And they didn't care about them. And the saddest thing is, as I said, many, many victim survivors were re-traumatized without the support that was available to them when the trials took place. And it took us no further forward. You're right. I mean, I prosecuted the Rochdale case in 2011, so it's 13 years plus since the convictions. I then led nationally on this issue. And we got to a stage within 2 or 3 years, Adrian, where we had made a massive improvement in the way we were tackling so-called grooming, but also child sexual abuse more generally. And by 2015, we had the highest conviction rate for child sexual abuse in British history. That was the work we did together to bring that about. But you wouldn't have believed that from what Musk and his people were saying. And so it was rewriting history. It was misinformation and disinformation. At the end of the day, it was just scandalous, really, what he got away with.
One of the narratives around the so-called grooming gangs scandal, and I don't doubt that it's a scandal. We'll come to the grooming gangs element of it in a little while. But one element of the narrative around it is the suggestion that social services and the police in the northwest of England, where you were operating, were fearful of treading into this area because it might damage race relations, because the young women themselves, mostly young white women, were not seen as being of equal value to other members of society. Is there a truth to that narrative, and did you have to fight against that to bring the prosecutions?
Yeah, of course there's going to be some truth to that, and that's why we had the ICSA inquiry, which lasted 7 years and looked at this, and we've had lots of local inquiries, and we'll have a national inquiry now as a result of that. Yes, there is some truth, but the reality is that actually when people want to think about conspiracy, they'd rather blame a conspiracy than the fact that lots of people were rubbish at their jobs. Incompetence is what was the main issue here. People, no disrespect to them, there were resourcing issues as well. If you're a social worker with 500 children to look after, I don't know how you do that. And so undoubtedly there were resources lacking. Some of it, yes, was around some kind of awareness or consideration that perhaps the communities wouldn't like it, which is complete bollocks. The communities wanted these men off the streets and in prison. And it was the state that wasn't doing their job properly, So the reality is that the people were desperate for criminals because, I think you just touched on it a moment ago, most of the victims were white girls, but there were also girls from South Asian backgrounds, from black backgrounds, and there were also some boys as well. So the point is the victims came from all manner of places. And by just focusing on the white victims and just focusing on the ethnicity of the perpetrators, I've said this before, it's quite dangerous to do that, because what you're saying to young white girls is avoid the brown man. And we know, and the most recent Home Office data says 88% of child sex offenders in this country are white men. You're actually saying to them, avoid the brown man, stick with the white man. And when the white man is going to be 40 times more likely to abuse you. So, it's dangerous to use that kind of language. At the end of the day, what we need to do is stop it from happening again. And the good news is that significant steps have been taken over the last decade or so, which have made major improvements in that area. But I think one of the issues that hasn't been touched on, and hopefully the inquiry will do, because undoubtedly I'll be called to give evidence, I think the issue of class hasn't been given the attention it deserves. The vast majority of the victims in this case were working class, whether they were from South Asian backgrounds or from white backgrounds, they were working class. And what people have forgotten, they've got really short memories. Do you remember back in the day, what was the language people were using? Chavs, brats, tarts. This was the language the mainstream media and therefore society generally was using about these girls. And they were then, as a result of that, they were being ignored, they were not being listened to, they were being allowed to be abused. The predators took advantage of the fact that we treated these girls, by we I mean society generally, we treated these girls with contempt. That's the issue. And if we can't go around saying, oh, it's just the social workers and their problem, the police didn't do their job. Yes, all of those things need to be addressed, and many of them have been. But we, as a society, need to recognise our part in all of this.
Yeah. One part of the narrative as well, and it's a racist narrative fed by far-right parties, is that there was a cultural issue here. And this is a narrative which it seems to me is designed to promote the otherness of Muslim men, of brown men, and maybe even of black men as well, but specifically in this instance, I think of Muslim men, to say that Muslim men operate to different standards, that the Muslim culture in the UK doesn't fit, quotes, our culture, mainstream culture. So it isn't just about bringing some perpetrators to justice. It is to hold these cases up as an example of how Islam, in all of its forms, not just militant radical political Islam, but how Islam is incompatible with UK life. Do you recognise that narrative?
No, not in the slightest.
No, but do you recognise that that's being woven?
I recognise the motivation behind some of the language that's been used around these cases.
Yeah.
And yes, That's what how you've identified it is exactly how some people want to address it. And there's yes, absolutely. Some of the perpetrators in this case were Muslim men. Some of them, I remember prosecuting one guy who was a member of the British National Party. And the British National Party, when they were confronted with his conviction, said, we've cancelled his membership. Sad news, Adrian, I cannot cancel the membership of all these Muslim guys that carried out these crimes. They don't represent me. I was a Muslim guy, and yet I got it in the neck, even though I was the one that brought these people to justice. So at the end of the day, it's very, very selective. I get what you're saying, absolutely. I don't think, it's not a cultural issue. It's a gender issue. Men, unfortunately, abuse women and girls. They have done. And if you just focus on the Muslim perpetrators, that doesn't explain the fact that 1 in 4 women in this country suffer domestic abuse, that 1 in 5 are sexually assaulted, that 2 women every week are killed by their partners or ex-partners, that 10 women kill themselves every week. And then I think people forgot this, because at the beginning of COVID, the Office for National Statistics published some research on this subject. And by the way, I've always been calling for research. I did it back in Parliament in 2012. But the research that ONS produced in the beginning of COVID was that in this country, Adrian, more than 3.1 million British adults were sexually abused as children. 1 in 20 people in this country, not by Muslims. So we have a problem with with child abuse. We have a problem with violence against women and girls, and we can't simply just say it's that lot over there.
That perspective, I think, is really interesting, because it does take us wider into this issue of toxic masculinity. And to point the finger at Muslims is obviously intended to be racially divisive. I've no doubt that is a deliberate act by many on the right, but it also takes the accusing finger away from the rest of us. And in that, I include myself, I include you. Not that we would be abusers, but we are men. We are part of that group that sadly has proved to be toxic to women too many times in history.
100%. Do you remember when Sarah Everard was murdered by the police officer, and women were immediately told afterwards, if you think you're going to be raped by a police officer, wave down a bus or a taxi. We tell women to change their behaviours. We tell women to watch what they dress, how much they drink, but we don't tell men to do anything. And yet men are the reason why women have to do all of these things. And we don't call it out, Adrian. I'll be honest with you, I have very few male friends. The reason why is that every single time I hear them being misogynistic or sexist, I tell them to fuck off. I call them out for what they've done. We need to be calling each other out when we come across. Hopefully people can be educated and changed in some way. But, we need to understand that we have a responsibility as men to call other men out. And the saddest thing about this week, when you had Greg Wallace and the allegations made against him, was there was a real opportunity for Greg Wallace to say, I totally understand how my behaviours have perhaps fallen short. I'm going to seek some help. I'm going to understand why it is that I behaved the way, or allegedly behaved the way I did. No, he decided to say that autism means he doesn't wear underwear. We got to the silly stage where we rather than have a conversation about what men can do and what men do, we decided to go down a completely different route. And that's where the media have now focused entirely on autism and underwear. Forgetting the fact that men like him and many others behave intolerably against women. So we need to bring the conversation back to why men do what they do, and how we can address that issue through education, through learning, through behaviours, through role modelling, etc., etc. And until we do that, women will never be safe.
And we've had decades, I think, of gentle pushback against what we now regard as toxic masculinity. However, over the last 15 or 20 years, and James Bloodworth, who I know you're going to be sharing a panel with shortly after we finish this recording, has explored this with his work, with exploring the manosphere and so on. There has been a really vicious pushback from people like Andrew Tate, but then with many other followers, I would suggest, on the right.
Social media is what it is. People live in echo chambers. The algorithm, if you click on Andrew Tate or something like him, all you get is other Andrew Tate-like messages. And the bigger, broader issues are, we always know that men have a significant mental health problem. That's why so many men commit suicide, for example. We know that, or take their own lives. We know that. We know that men routinely, unfortunately, get involved in the kinds of behaviours that we've touched on. So the online sphere, is making things worse. But we've got to rewind. Why is it this way? And it goes. I mean, I don't know. I'm not. As I said, I would love research in this area. I'd love historians to tell me different. But go back to the 80s. Bad things were bad on television and radio. You know, they were all bad. We know the stuff. I prosecuted some of them. But men had a job. Their mining was open. Steel mines were open. There were jobs that routinely were seen as male working class jobs, and they were available now. They've all gone. AI is going to, even more of them are going to go over the years to come. Women have made massive strides in the last 40 years in terms of getting into the workplace, progressing within the organisation. And so many men see that as a threat. I don't have a job anymore. She's got a job. What's wrong with this world? And then the social media then amplifies all of that. Women gone too far. Push back. So there's a responsibility on social media platforms, undoubtedly, but I can't control that. You can't control that. What we can control is ourselves within our own community of men having conversations about this subject, being open about how we feel about these things, not being scared to say that I've got biases and I've got prejudices. Can you help me deal with them? We shouldn't be doing what Rishi Sunak did, which was to say the only reason I'm tackling violence against women and girls is because I've got daughters. It shouldn't be because of your daughters or your wife or your mother. It should be because all women deserve to be treated fairly and respectfully and free from violence. But we need this very, very vocal conversation. And the conversation we're going to have very shortly in this byline will be around encouraging men to have conversations. Later on this year, November this year, it's not public knowledge yet, but we are organising a men and boys, or boys and men symposium, where we want men to start talking about this publicly and what it is why they feel the way they feel, and what we can do, whether it's through education or role modelling or whatever solutions exist, but then to develop our own solutions. Boys and men need to step up and start addressing the issues that currently mean that women are not safe.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Byline Podcast, recorded live anyway, at Keele University in the midst of the Byline Festival. If you've heard any background noise, I do hope you can forgive it, but I think you'll agree it's been worth it for the conversation. Don't forget as well to subscribe to the Byline Times. Head over to bylinetimes.com to take out your subscription. You get a fantastic monthly magazine dropping through your letterbox and support the great work that we do here. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Bye.